Like, these are my friends and colleagues being killed. It wasn't my war, and yet somehow it was. It's a bloodbath, and people were making extraordinary art in the midst of this bloodbath. But what happens to identity in conditions of terror? Ukraine needs to be the new avant-garde. Yeah, I was extremely captivated by the Maidan. That's really when I mean, I've been going to Ukraine for more than 20 years, but it was the Maidan that really captured me because it reminded me of all the reasons why I was so captivated by Eastern Europe when I was an impressionable 17-year-old and the Berlin Wall came down. You know, all of these ideas about truth and subjectivity and human dignity and freedom that had been part of this dissident philosophical discourse and then forgotten in the 1990s. They all came back on the Maidan, and that was an extraordinary thing, even from a distance to witness. But also, I mean, there's the very basic human fact that on some level, the world is always divided into people we know personally and people we don't know personally. I think that distinction cuts across race, class, ethnicity, nation. And so this gruesome war that's been going on that I've been following since 2014, like these are my friends and colleagues being killed. And when it's people who are being, I mean, you can't make a moral argument that the lives of people you know are worth more than the lives of people you don't know. And I do feel guilty for not knowing more about what's going on in Sudan, for instance, or for not speaking more about Gaza. But these are my friends. These are the people I work on translation projects with. These are the people I saw at conferences. These are the people I had been in dialogue with, on doing all sorts of, ordinary, banal, the kinds of academic intellectual projects that people do, right? The people I talk about philosophy with, the people I exchange chapters or essays that I'm working on. So when they're being bombed, I couldn't, I had no distance from it, even though it wasn't my war, and yet somehow it was because these were my friends. And so it just wasn't possible for me to keep a distance because they're people I mean, I think that human level has to be taken into I mean, I'm sure you know maybe more people than I do, but like I know people personally who have been tortured in Russian captivity, who have been tied to boards and electrocuted. And it's gruesome enough that that ever happens anywhere to anybody. But when it happens to somebody you can't say like, okay, I'm not going to get involved in that, or I'm not going to say anything about that. That was somehow it never even occurred to me that I could not get involved. That's an interesting question because, sir, to some extent, the target audiences is not like I'm not the target audience, right? The target audiences is in principle people who don't necessarily know much about Malevich to begin with, or might know nothing about the avant-garde to begin with, or and it's such a multi-layered history in which you have tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy. I mean, you have all of the oppression of the Tsarist Empire, all the bloodiness of the First World War, yeah, and the Bolshevik Revolution, and then like the Bolshevik Civil War, and then Kiev, as you know as well as I do, is just occupied by multiple armies, one after another. It was a bloodbath, and people were making extraordinary art in the midst of this bloodbath, which is still something that, from the perspective of intellectual history, you're always shaken into, how is it even possible to think in these circumstances? And that wasn't just Ukrainians, it's also Russians and Belarusians and Poles and all these people who, Shklovsky's writing Sentimental Journey, and, people's heads are being chopped off in the background, and you're talking about literary theory, and they're like, and I mean, that testimony to the human condition and the human possibility and conditions of extremity, um, and human creativity, and how we respond to violence, how we respond to terror, what happens to identity in conditions of terror, what happens to identity in conditions of war, when are people willing to take risk? When do people get in line and shut up? Those are questions that we all need to be delving into because they are both they're an exploitation. They reveal the exploitation of weaknesses that are inherent in the human condition, and also they illuminate the extraordinary possibilities, of strength and creativity in the human condition. And without looking at that, we're impoverishing our own understanding of what human life is about. Well, as has been mentioned, like I have this fantasy that Ukraine needs to be the new avant-garde, and that means they have to be the best versions of themselves. Like this whole idea of catching up with the West, of everything exciting is going on in Paris, it's over. like I mean, the West has clearly revealed itself to be a disaster in all sorts of fronts. I mean, I say this as a heartbroken and crushed American. We need something new. And I think one of the things that tragically went wrong after 1989 was the whole trope of catching up. The assumption that everything that the West was kind of on this path, there was an end of history. And these more backward places just need to catch up, and like the sources of evil, like Putinism, can be kind of tamed or domesticated through free trade relations and enlightened economic self interest, with this naturally going to encourage everyone to become good liberal Democrats. Didn't work. Whatever you think of the theory, empirically speaking, it didn't work. And so now we need something new. And so my fantasy for Ukraine is really this kind of radical cosmopolitanism that it's going to model a civic identity that is going to be inclusive, that's going to be based on values, and not ethnicity, that is going to be fearless in looking at the past with eyes wide open and telling the truth, that is going to look for the new. I mean, I think about like the ways that, I mean, we have an American president now, who thinks like global warming is a hoax. Ukraine is going to have to rebuild. They should rebuild in clean energy and show everybody else how to do it. And all of the best people working on clean energy should go there. Like that, like that should be the laboratory where the best things happen. And all of like the hell of what people have been through, and all of the disabilities and the amputations, and the PTSD treatment, like that should become a model for everyone. Everything should be rebuilt to accommodate all those people in wheelchairs and all those people with prosthetic limbs. Everything should be rebuilt in such a way as to be the avant-garde of inclusivity. This is my like to teach the rest of us. Like, and the whole kind of defensive posture of catching up and showing the West that we also have great poets, and we also have the whole defensiveness has to be put aside, and you guys have to lead because like the rest of us have proven a disaster. Like, and so we need something else. We need something better. We need hope. I think Ukrainians need a lot of support. I think there needs to be a sense that, we're asking Ukrainians to do a lot. Like we're asking Ukrainians to honor the Geneva Convention when the Russians are not, right? We're saying like you know better than I do how Ukrainian captives are treated in Russian captivity. And you still need to be the people who are not going to do the same thing to the Russian captives. Like you need to take the moral high ground. And that is hard. That is really, really hard because you're asking people who are undergoing inhuman suffering, to behave very well. And that requires a lot of support. And I feel like I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do is just kind of mobilize the sport. That we need to be supporting Ukrainian students. We need to be not letting them feel isolated. We need to be not letting the men feel isolated. All of these young men who can't leave the country just at that moment, in their lives where the world should be opening to them, and the doors have closed, and they have a right to be angry and they have a right to be resentful, and we can't fix that right now, but we can support those. That's why I feel like it's worth my going to Ukraine and giving seminars to Ukrainian students or, to the men who can't leave if I've, taught the women somewhere else. It's not like I'm going there and saving anyone. It's not like I actually have any useful practical skills. I mean, I'm one of the most impractical people I know. When Yatsenuk invited me to speak at the Kiev Security Forum, my husband was saying, okay, now the situation is really desperate when I ask you to speak at a security forum because you're the least practical person I know. which is true. Like, it's not like it's not like I show up and I'm of practical use to anyone, but I do feel like that moral support matters. You need to, like, people's suffering needs to be acknowledged, and the conditions they're in need to be acknowledged, and the strength of resilience they're showing need to be acknowledged and appreciated, and then,
He is the founder of abstract art.
we need to be sending aid and we need to be sending our best people. I've been trying now really for the past 3, 4 years under this, you know, desperately hopeful idea that the world will not end, that there will be peremoha, that the Russian regime will fall, that there will be a radical reset, a stundenul, that there will be rebuilding, and I've been talking to many of my best students who are not Ukrainian at all about how that is going to be the place to be. That's going to be where the new technology is developing, and hopefully not only new drone technology, which apparently is extraordinary, but that's going to be where the new energy technology is building, the new architecture like that's going to be, and that's really exciting. And that should be its own draw. And we should be sending all the best people everywhere in the world to help with this project of rebuilding a society in a way that is structured so that human life is valued and people are encouraged to treat one another decently. Because otherwise, I fear that the world is about to end.